Hello, and welcome to the Population Factor. I'm your host, Phil Cafaro. Today on the Population Factor, we discuss rewilding with my guest, Tom Butler. Tom is a longtime advocate for wildlife and wildlands. After many years as Vice President for Conservation Advocacy at the Foundation for Deep Ecology and Tompkins Conservation, he's currently a Senior Fellow at the Northeast Wilderness Trust. Tom is the author or editor of more than a dozen books, including Plundering Appalachia, Keeping the Wild, and Energy, Overdevelopment and the Delusion of Endless Growth. Tom, welcome to the Population Factor.
Well, thanks, Phil. It's a pleasure to be with you. Very nice to see you.
Great to see you. I think most of our viewers will have a sense of what wild nature is. But rewilding, we should talk a little bit about what that term means. So to start out, I thought I would read just the vision paragraph from the Global Charter for Rewilding the Earth. This was developed by you and some other people for the 11th World Wilderness Conference. So the vision statement reads, "We believe that the world can be more beautiful, more diverse, more equitable, more wild. We believe that nature's innate resilience, bolstered by human care, can initiate an era of planetary healing. In that future time, when the world is whole and healthy, undammed rivers will run to the sea, their estuaries teeming with life. Following ancient patterns, whales and warblers will migrate unmolested through sea and sky. From tiny phytoplankton to tallest redwoods, all Earth's creatures will be free to pursue lives of quality, and humanity will thrive amidst nature's abundance." So that's the vision. How do we begin to get there? What's the practice of rewilding?
We get there place by place, project by project, person by person, group by group, hectare by hectare, working incrementally to rewild the earth and help nature heal. Before we even sort of talk about that, the mechanics of that or the specific application, let me just sort of tease out that word rewilding, because it may be a little bit unfamiliar to some of your listeners, although it's certainly a term now that's gotten widespread adoption within the conservation community, conservation movement. But outside that fairly small family, it may be less familiar. Rewilding as a term was coined by the wilderness activist Dave Foreman back in the 1990s and popularized in the now defunct but late great journal Wild Earth, which I at the time happened to be working on that project. Dave Foreman was the co-founder and the publisher at the time. And there needed to be a term for ecological restoration writ large. You know, at that time in the 1990s, there was a whole lot of interesting science that was emerging in the field of conservation biology and landscape ecology about how systems work and how ecosystems are damaged and how they can begin to heal again when missing species and processes are allowed or helped to recover. But there wasn't a term for large-scale wilderness recovery. At that point, when people talked about restoration, they really meant cleaning up a brownfield or a Superfund site. And it was very site-based, not system-focused. And Dave coined that term rewilding as a stand-in for this larger idea of wilderness recovery on a very large scale, on a scale large enough for those missing species like apex predators and processes to reassert themselves across the landscape. And in the few decades since the term was introduced in the conservation community, it's become broadly embraced and accepted. And it means different things to different people, but at its very simplest, to me, it is helping nature heal. That is something that happens through our conscious action. Rewilding can also happen passively if we simply step back and let natural processes reassert themselves across the landscape.
So one thing we're getting at when we use the term rewilding is ecological restoration and or preservation on a large scale. But another thing we're getting at with that word is greater freedom from nature. And in a way, that's paradoxical because some rewilding efforts involve management, but with the goal of getting to a point where you don't have to manage as much. Um,
Exactly.
can you say a little bit about that aspect of rewilding?
Sure. You've actually drilled right in on a little bit of a predicament, but and a paradox, but also one of the things that make a rewilding approach to conservation so interesting, so engaging. So this idea of active intervention with the goal and with an attitude of humility. And to me, that's the best approach. If we're trying to say that the earth deserves freedom, all creatures deserve lives of quality, ecosystems deserve to flourish and evolve on their for their own sake and in their own way. Yet we're going to be engaged in helping that. To me, the analogy is a little bit like medicine. When you're sick or you've had an injury, you seek medical care, and when you talk to the doctor, she doesn't heal you. She may intervene by setting a broken bone or prescribing a medication or doing an operation on you, but it's the body's innate healing powers ultimately that will determine whether you recover or not. Medicine bolsters and amplifies those innate qualities. To me, it's the same thing with active intervention, restoration techniques in an overall rewilding approach. Nature's in the driver's seat, but that doesn't mean that there aren't ways that we can help nature heal, again, with that attitude of humility and with the ultimate goal of stepping back and letting ecosystems flourish in their own ways, in their own good time. Does that make sense?
Hopefully, I think it makes sense. It makes sense to me. Now, hopefully, as we get into this program, we'll be able to talk a little bit about Iberá National Park in Argentina, a rewilding program of the Tompkins Foundation. Um, and I was getting ready for this show, and I went on the Tompkins Foundation website. I made a few clicks and got to the National Geographic 20-minute film about Iberá. And I'd really encourage viewers to go check that out if you can. Um, it's so interesting because it talks about a variety of reintroduction efforts, including giant anteaters, scarlet macaws, jaguars. So this is what we're talking about, bringing species back that either have been totally extirpated from an area, or they might be there in small numbers, but they need a boost to get back to more robust populations, long-term sustainable populations. And to watch the team sort of doing all the spade work to get ready to release the jaguar, and then you see
Mhm.
the jaguar in the pen, and then the door opens and it's released out into the wild. It's very moving, and it's exactly what you're talking about. We're helping bring the jaguars back, but the goal isn't to keep having to manage jaguars.
That's exactly right. The long-term goal is for all the creatures and the processes in that ecosystem to be operating in ways that expand beauty and expand ecological health, that advance the integrity of the whole system. But the active intervention there is so amazing. And here I'm so first of all, I'm delighted you watched that short film and saw the energy of that team. The handful of times that I've had the opportunity to visit that place and interact with my former colleagues there who worked for Tompkins Conservation and the Argentine spinoff, which is now called Rewilding Argentina. Every time I've gone down there, I've come back and just been so hopeful that at the ambition and the scale of the work there. And I admit to feeling a little bit not quite resentful but envious that conservationists in North America don't have the same vision and creativity for this kind of large scale work. because what they have accomplished and are accomplishing in the Iberá marshlands ecosystem is just astounding. So I hope viewers will go watch that short film and see the video and interact with some of those leaders in the team, especially Sophia Heinonen and Sebastian DiMartino and others on the team. They're very creative. But just to sort of put their work in the context of this overarching frame of what rewilding can be as an overarching framework for conservation. To me, it's really three parts, and that is protecting specific places from the current ecological threats or past problems, and helping heal those ecological wounds from past land use practices. And by healing those wounds, it may mean just a hands-off approach, or it might mean active intervention like reintroducing missing species or augmenting smaller populations or disjunct populations with translocations of animals to help bolster that. Or it might mean helping advance natural processes like intact free-flowing hydrology. Maybe it means removing dams or barriers like in the Iberá marshlands. That was actually, for a short time, there was a series of diking for kind of industrial agriculture that was threatening edges of the marshlands, which, first of all, let's just step back and say the Iberá wetlands ecosystem is one of the largest freshwater complexes in South America. It's kind of the Pantanal of northern Argentina. So it's this vast subtropical wetland. So that's save particular places, reintroduce missing species and processes. And then the third part of that is arguably just as crucial, and that is rewilding our hearts and minds, rewilding ourselves.
I'm glad you got to that. I wanted to ask you about that.
Because ultimately, we're not going to get to a framework of global conservation with a rewilding mission if we're not allowing and advancing that to happen. And that's the part of rewilding ourselves. But in the Iberá project, we can see all of those things happening. There was work for decades to get an Iberá provincial park and an Iberá national park, contiguous protected area, designated officially and managed as a protected area. It's now the sort of largest wildlife habitat protected area, a park in Argentina. And then the second part of that is this very, very robust wildlife recovery program with reintroducing, as you said, giant anteaters and giant otters, jaguars, macaws, pampas deer, and other species. And then the third part of that is really the outreach and the communications work that those Argentine conservationists have done, both locally, getting local communities to embrace the idea of a destination wildlife watching reserve that advances sort of the economic viability of these small communities that surround the protected area, and how that is in alignment with their cultural values, longstanding cultural traditions, not in opposition to them. So those three parts of a rewilding approach to conservation are all embodied in that Iberá project.
So let's talk a little more about the health angle of this, because it's something you brought up several times now, and we could talk about it in the context of Iberá. From what little I've gleaned in reading about it and watching the film, this was an area that not too long ago was mostly in private hands, right? Quite a bit of it in any case.
It was a mix, yes, but private and public.
And so, some of the uses were either not compatible with preserving wild nature, or maybe they were overdone. So, maybe a certain amount of hunting is okay, but maybe there was overhunting. The film talked a little about this and how, well, as with our Everglades here in the U.S., there was plume hunting, really harvesting plumes from birds, and so bird populations plummeted. Caimans were overhunted, et cetera, et cetera. So, from various perspectives, you could talk about missing ecological processes. You could talk about interference with those processes. You could talk about some species that were extirpated or nearly extirpated. And I think you like to think about that in terms of uh, ill health, and bringing this back to the landscape is trying to create a healthier landscape.
That's exactly right. And in this case, of course, a healthier landscape, one of more beauty and abundance, wildlife abundance, drives economic vitality of the local communities. So as long as the fortunes of those people are linked to beauty and abundance, local communities are absolutely going to support that. And that is a key part of the strategy here. And frankly, this is all in that region of Argentina. This is all very new. Now, it's not to say that Argentina's history with national parks is new. They've had an excellent national park system going back to the actually to the genesis of it was in 1903 from a private donation into public ownership. So and they have a very strong and professional national parks administration. But this particular area, we're talking about Corrientes province,
Northeastern Argentina.
northeastern Argentina, and an area that is in some ways culturally distinct from Argentina. People, as my understanding, people from that province, Correntinos, think of themselves first as Correntinos and not Argentines. And so there's, in that way, it kind of might be like Texas, people from
Right.
Texas are Texans, and then maybe they're Americans. That's sort of kind of cultural devotion to their particular place. But that area or surrounding the Ibera marshlands region is not a wealthy area, and really until very recently had no long-standing tradition with ecotourism, with wildlife watching, with the kind of economic development that could be linked to a protected area. That's now changed, and due to the excellent work of the team at Rewilding Argentina. And the threats to that place were, as you mentioned, really a hunting and poaching culture, and also a ranching efforts that were are nibbling around the edges of the marshlands region. In some places were somewhat destructive to the ecological health of the place. And then the threat of industrial agriculture, and particularly rice farming, at one point was a real threat to the health of the marshlands. So presenting an alternative, an economic alternative to that, that would be attractive and could show real gains for local communities was integral to the conservation success. And these little series of 12 or 13 little communities surrounding the marshlands, at one point, I think all the mayors of every single one of those communities got on board in embracing the idea of a scenic driving route around the marshlands, and coordinated signage and portals where people could stop and go in and do wildlife watching and hiking and take tours into the marshlands. And so it really is an example of a large-scale rewilding project that has both an ecological health component and an economic vitality component.
And I think you often find that with these rewilding projects. I'm a little more familiar with projects in Europe, and quite often you've got sort of a template for these, whether you're talking about the Oder River Delta in Germany and Poland, or whether you're talking about the Velebit Mountains in Croatia. These are often areas that have, in Europe, that have an agricultural history, and agriculture, but they're areas that are not the greatest for agriculture, so they're not particularly productive. And so in many parts of Europe, you've had a decrease in the amount of area under crops. You've had a great decrease in the rural populations in a lot of these
Yes,
places.
exactly.
And so, they've sort of been bypassed by progress, but the question is always what's going to come next. And one thing that can come next, as you say, are various efforts to ratchet up industrial agriculture. But something that certainly is better for wild nature and is often better for the communities involved is some sort of ecotourism, some sort of effort to mesh some traditional agriculture with leaving more of the landscape wild. Um, and then within that framework, the Europeans will often put together these kind of rewilding projects. And again, if everything comes together correctly, it can really be a win-win for nature and for the human communities involved.
Exactly. I'm glad you brought up that Rewilding Europe context. The NGO Rewilding Europe is the nonprofit sort of that's helping spearhead and advance rewilding efforts in Europe. It's not the only one, but it's doing fantastic work. Many interesting projects are falling under its banner now, including you mentioned several, but one that I know a little bit about is this Three Kingdoms project in Spain. Is being spearheaded by a former colleague, Ignacio Jimenez, who actually helped found the rewilding program in the Iberá marshlands. He's a Spanish
Ah,
biologist, but he was at Rewilding Argentina for more than a decade, and he was the one who first started the giant anteater reintroduction program, first got the permits to translocate animals and create a new founder population of a native species that had been extirpated. So that was all new. And it's interesting, and actually Ignacio has written a book about that experience and about rewilding principles. And this is where we get to the cultural context. What did it take to found and start and create such success in the Iberá? And then I'll morph back, sort of segue back to your European context. Well, for one thing, it took the vision and the financial resources of Christine Tompkins and the late Douglas Tompkins, who advanced and funded that program. So we give them tremendous credit. But sort of underneath them, sort of the people on the team, the biologists and the veterinarians and all of the program people in that wildlife recovery project, they had to get over those cultural hurdles. And for Ignacio and some of the other team members, that meant going and sitting in little offices of local wildlife officials and political authorities and drinking endless cups of mate and talking and talking and talking and talking and drinking more mate and drinking more mate and drinking more mate and talking. And the result of that was eventually you get your permit to try something new through a Byzantine Argentine bureaucracy, which has, a local level, a provincial level, and a federal level, a national level. So the work they did there allowed, in effect, I think, is helping advance through wildlife related ecotourism, allowing a community not to depopulate, for rural exodus not to occur. Whereas the point you just raised in Europe, some of these projects, like the Three Kingdoms project in Spain, the potential there is really because of this phenomenon of rural depopulation, rural exodus, as young people move from the villages into the cities and more marginal farmlands are abandoned. So rewilding linked to protected areas and wildlife watching and related cultural and ecological tourism really offers the best, or maybe it's not the best, a wonderful opportunity to maintain kind of cultural vibrance while also expanding ecological health. It's really sort of the best of both worlds. That phenomenon of rural depopulation, though, is it may be very common now in parts of Europe and I mean the Great Plains of the U.S.
absolutely.
It's not an unknown phenomenon in other parts of the world as well. It does present extraordinary opportunities to be thinking about large-scale wilderness recovery, large-scale protected areas, large-scale national parks, and wildlife recovery programs.
Yeah, thinking about a Great Plains context, you know, I don't know, the Great Plains might be something like 1/5 to 1/4 of the lower 48 states, depending on how you define it. And most of the counties in the Great Plains have fewer people today than they did in 1920, kind of a
Exactly.
staggering figure. And so one of the things you're seeing in some places on the plains are new efforts at big conservation, at rewilding on a large scale. There's a project in central Montana, and I'm blanking on the name of it now. You might know
American
it, Tom.
Prairie Reserve. Yes,
American
it's the
Prairie
American
Reserve,
Prairie Reserve. Yes, fabulous
and
project.
yeah, and so there's this effort to um, purchase or put land conservation easements on, 1 or 2 million acres of land eventually, hopefully, and and restore some of the large herbivores, above all the buffalo, perhaps restore apex predators. Now, as you know, there's also great pushback from that, because a lot of the ranchers in the area, they don't like the project. At some level, it seems to them that it's a negative commentary on their efforts. Other ranchers do like the project, either because there's a part of them that likes the rewilding ideal, or because it might be a way for them to get more money selling their ranches. I mean, people have various motivations, but it's interesting that those kind of efforts are going forward now, because at a larger scale, it's really about how human beings are going to be relating to the natural world. Do we want more or less land set aside for other species? Do we want more or fewer opportunities to see and experience wild landscapes?
Mhm.
Or do we have other goals that are more important? So it's a big question.
It's a big question, and you've just like jumped into an area where we could spend a week just chewing over that conundrum, that predicament of where cultural traditions are linked to certain kinds of resource extraction. Can they ever be made durable and sustainable, or do they have to go away? And how difficult that is for cultures when they do go away. So let's kind of tease that out for a minute and think about it. One can certainly imagine the Great Plains, with, at least I can, with vast systems of protected areas and bison herds, while also supporting vibrant family farms and ranches. That those are not mutually exclusive goals. Um, if that kind of ranching culture can persist, and if it does, and I come from a ranching family, I don't think the threat to it is the fact that someone wants to create more protected areas for wild nature to flourish. The true threats to it are more economic and climatic. Is it going to be possible to raise cattle in areas that have 10 inches of or less of precipitation annually, and where the climate change models show that sooner or later those places, like the shortgrass prairie of parts of eastern Wyoming and parts of Montana, that may well be desert in a few decades. There may not be cattle ranching appropriate still in some parts of the place where it's done now, and the conditions are going to be beyond any of us to solve. But it may be easy for people to sort of throw darts at conservationists who want, particularly those who want more of wild nature to flourish, but that's not the real threat in my mind. But there are also some kinds of extraction, I would suggest, that simply are not supportable, either ethically or economically. Um, you know, it used to be, if we were sitting here having this conversation 100 years ago, um, people would be very supportive of the whaling industry. We're not anymore. There's no commercial reason to kill our cousins, the large animals who live in the sea, our distant cousins, because we need to render their blubber for oil to light our lamps. It's economically a non-starter. It's a moot point. We do not need to extract them. Now, if the whaling industry had had enough cultural clout to say, well, it doesn't matter, you can light your house with other things, but just because whaling is so fun and so part of our culture, we should keep doing it. I would suggest that that is not a compelling argument, which isn't to say that wouldn't have been wrenching for those families and communities linked to whaling as it dissipated as an industry. It's hard when things go away that you've counted on, or we could say the same thing about coal mining in Appalachia.
Sure,
I mean, there are
sure.
families that fed themselves and grew their communities related to digging that coal and blowing off the tops of those mountains. But globally, that activity can no longer be supported. It is a global threat to everyone, every every lump of coal that continues to be combusted as those CO2 molecules go into the atmosphere. So while it might be a nice thing for some people to still have the traditions and the skills related to that activity, it's no longer supportable as a viable thing going forward. And that's tough. That's hard, but it's
Yeah.
reality.
Well, I mean, this is part of having a society, right? I mean, you need an economy to support people, but a society that doesn't discipline its economy in various ways for higher values really isn't a human society at all. So this is an ongoing discussion and argument that we'll be having as long as we have human societies. I would just like, I
Exactly.
mean, this is a show called The Population Factor. So I would just like to bring in a further point here, and that's the more people we have overall in a society, globally, whatever scale we want to look at, um, the more people we have, the more opportunities that will foreclose to share the landscape generously with other species. And so, um, sometimes, and you've given a good example in Iberá, I think, there are others as well. Sometimes the most economically profitable use is preservation. I mean, that is absolutely true in many places. But it's also true that at the margins, those of us who want to preserve nature would hope that we'll be willing to forego some profit and simply preserve more land, more species, be willing to lose a few more cattle to the jaguars, et cetera, et cetera. The more people we have, the more people we have to feed, provide energy, provide housing, et cetera, um, the more resources we're going to have to take away from other species.
The more difficult it becomes. Yes. Let's step back and think about what's an overarching goal for rewilding the earth. Um, I think the ultimate objective, of course, as you stated in that vision statement, is that all native species on this planet would have the space and the room and the freedom to flourish, to have lives of quality. And making space for all our relations to have those lives of quality and to pursue happiness and have freedom and habitat for all, that essentially requires area. And we will either be willing to allow other species to have that terrain for their homes and happiness, or we will not, because for better or worse, humanity in its current incarnation is in the driver's seat. So it is a conscious decision, one based on humility and ethics, to create a system of protected areas at the scale adequate enough to support all of life's diversity. The best way to get there, of course, is to have a stable and then a diminishing human population achieved through the most responsible and humane means, which primarily, of course, means educating girls in the developing world, advancing the rights of women everywhere, and making reproductive health choices universally available. Those are the kinds of things that should be, I think, sort of a non-starter in terms of agreement across the political spectrum. I think, a political left to political right, shouldn't we all be able to agree that there should be gender equity, and that particularly girls in the underdeveloped world should be educated, and that people should have the right and autonomy and the tools and information to make family planning choices? I mean, that should it not be kind of
I think
widely and
I
universally endorsed?
I think there's a strong moral argument for that, and I think very clearly in international law and through UN treaties that almost all the world's nations have agreed to, there's a global commitment to all of that. Um, Having said that, I think it's a much easier sell in Sweden or even the United States, gender equity, than it is in more conservative parts of the world.
Tougher in
Um,
Iran or Afghanistan or Pakistan for sure.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
And
Um,
other, yeah, but sort of, but let's assume for a second, zooming out to the big vision, that we could embrace that whole range of life affirming tools for stabilizing and then gradually reducing the human population through voluntary and non-coercive means. Well, that in effect, if we get the sort of the human population bottlenecked through that narrow opening as quickly as possible and on the slow and decline toward a more stable and resilient, sort of durable number for a human population size, then that frees up all kinds of opportunities for ecological recovery that will hope happen both passively and actively through our intervention if we choose to do so. And I mean, this is really the great opportunity for the next century, for the second half and really end the next century. That once that human population begins to stabilize and create and have that slow downhill slide, then rewilding efforts can really advance quickly. Um, and then we can get as much of biodiversity as possible through this current calamity, this great sixth extinction crisis in Earth history. Um, and on the backside of that, there's again this human benefit as well. It of course is, I come from the spectrum of the conservation community, and my work with Tompkins Conservation and with Northeast Wilderness Trust is all based on the idea that wild places and wild creatures have intrinsic value. They have inherent worth. We don't protect them because they're necessarily valuable to us. We protect nature for nature's sake. But by doing so, that's also wildly beneficial for humanity. And a rewilding framework for Earth is actually our best chance of maintaining a beautiful, durable human civilization long into the future. Because the trajectory we are on right now is very grim and very dark for humanity, and very unlikely that human civilization will persist in the way that we have known it in recent decades.
So even if we had no concern with giant river otters in Iberá or scarlet macaws or cougars or wolves in Colorado, really to continue to increase our population and increase our demands on nature um, threatens human well-being. I noticed when I was on the Tompkins Conservation website, for every one of the new national parks and protected areas they describe, there's a little bit of a history of how they were protected. There's a little bit of a natural history about what is being protected. But there's also, for each one of them, figures about how much carbon is being sequestered by not cutting down the forests. So, that has to play a role in all this too. And those of us who believe in that intrinsic value of nature, I think it's well worth our reminding our more economically minded friends and neighbors, these places are working for you too, even if you don't want to see the macaws.
Exactly. Those utilitarian arguments And economic arguments, work with some people. They work maybe better with most people than the intrinsic value argument. I think those things again are not mutually exclusive. We can protect wild places and wild creatures, and we can recreate interconnected systems of protected areas large enough, resilient enough, both to help mitigate climate change and to support biological diversity, kind of all the members in the community of life. We can do that whether or not our motivation is because we want our grandchildren to inherit a living planet and have a good quality of life, or because the thing that feeds our soul is to be out in the Boundary Waters wilderness, or in some Western landscape, and have in the Yellowstone ecosystem and hear a wolf howl, and have that connection with our kind of wild kin in a most visceral way. It doesn't, the motivation really is sort of less important than the fact that everyone potentially on Earth benefits from a rewilding conservation framework, especially if that framework advances quickly enough to mitigate climate chaos. Right now, the very best tool for mitigating or for climate, for carbon sequestration and storage happens to be a tree. Trees, wetlands, peatlands, intact natural grasslands sequester and store vast amounts of carbon. And so the idea of sort of quick transformation of our energy economy away from fossil fuels toward renewables is crucial. But you could do that, and if you don't fix the wilderness destruction problem and the ever expanding human numbers and behavior that goes along with the kind of expanding human footprint problem, if you don't do that, then all the hydrogen cars, solar panels, and wind turbines on the planet will not save us. It's not enough. We have to do all of those things. We have to create a steady state economy that doesn't pretend that the Earth is infinite when it's not. And we have to transform that energy economy toward renewables, and we have to stop the wilderness destruction problem, and then begin to, well, not just and then, at the same time, create vast new protected areas that can store and sequester carbon. That can be done even, with the current human population size to some extent, but its
Right.
full flourishing is not going to happen until, the human population stabilizes. Because for better and worse, we're adding, what is it, about 225,000 new people to the global family every single day.
That's right. About 80 to 85 million annually.
Right. And I used to hear that 85 million to 90 million or so annually, that's a kind of a large number and it's an abstraction. But when someone explained to me that, if you've ever been into a large stadium for a concert or a sporting event, and you go in that, Yankee Stadium or whatever, and you sit there with 50,000 other people, and somebody makes a great play and everybody cheers. It feels like a lot of people if you're sitting there with 50,000 or 49,999 other folks. Well, now fill that stadium up 4 times and start again. And that's the number of human beings that get added to our population every 24 hours. And of course, we would want all of those people, every single one of them, to have a decent quality of life and not be sort of trapped in a life of poverty or struggle. We want each of them to have a life of beauty and potential. And that takes, for wherever you're born, some level of resource to support that life. So less people probably means, over the long term, not probably, will mean better lives of quality for other humans, as well as for our fellow members in the land community, all the creatures with which we share the planet.
So it's important to keep in mind that there are, those trade-offs as we think about population policy. Um, So we talked a little bit about Iberá National Park in Argentina. I thought maybe I might give you a chance to reminisce a little bit and maybe tell our viewers about another place they might not have heard of. Uh, Tell me if I'm pronouncing this correctly. Kaweskar National Park, another
Yeah,
park that helped to be set up by the Tompkins, and this grabbed my attention because its area is over 7 million acres. I think Yellowstone is something like 2.2 or 2.4 million. So we're talking about an immense new national park created in central Chile. Can you tell us? Have you been to that park? Can you
I
tell
have
us
not
anything
been
about
to,
it?
I have not been to that protected area. I have flown along the Chilean coastline in a small plane with the late Douglas Tompkins right in that area, however. Yes, several years ago. Um, I can tell you a little bit about the package deal that created Coescar
Okay,
and added several other new national parks to the natural heritage of the Chilean park system through the work of Tompkins Conservation. This whole deal resulted really from decades of work, really driven by Christine Tompkins and the late Douglas Tompkins, who was an American entrepreneur well known as a mountaineer and a rock climber, and also for founding a couple of very prominent American companies, including we co-founded Esprit, the fashion company, and before that,
right.
he founded a little ski shop in San Francisco, which he called the North Face, and that went on. He didn't actually make his great wealth from that company, but it went on to be a behemoth in the outdoor apparel industry. Well, when Doug sold his half interest in Esprit in the late 1980s and in the early 1990s, married Christine McDivitt, who was then the then CEO of the Patagonia company. They relocated to South America, spending part of their time in Chile and part in Argentina, and they essentially created a set of nonprofits, charitable foundations, to channel their wealth into land conservation. Doug Tompkins used to talk about paying his rent for living on the planet and sort of, the payback, making up for all of the mindless consumption he had promoted by through the merchandising of, t-shirts. You're old enough to remember, there's the period when every teenage girl in the United States wanted a t-shirt that it said Esprit right
Absolutely,
in front of it.
absolutely.
Well, all those t-shirts actually got recycled into huge amounts of land conservation in Chile and Argentina. Coescar and several other national parks were created out of a package deal at the end of the term of President Michelle Bachelet, when Christine Tompkins worked closely with her administration and essentially said, we'll give you all of our remaining holdings, privately held and managed conservation lands in Chile. At that point, it was well over 1 million acres. Or if you'll create this series, if you'll accept and expand the system of national parks. So in the area of Coescar, we had a private conservation holding, which we donated to the federal government. And in turn, the government designated this new national park out of which largely federal lands that had been a national reserve with a lower level of protection. The two flagship protected areas from that deal were Pumalin National Park, a little farther to the north, and
Right.
Patagonia National Park in the grasslands of the Chacabuco Valley. Both of these places we had also spent, or the team, the Tompkins Conservation Team had spent years and years and years creating public access infrastructure, campgrounds, hiking trails, a visitor center, all of the kind of accoutrements we're used to in very well capitalized national parks in North America, but in the Chilean park system, much higher quality because of that system, which is a really extraordinary ecological jewels, is very much underfunded and undercapitalized relative to the quality of the lands it safeguards. So right at the tail end of the Bachelet administration, this deal was struck. Christine Tompkins and the foundations gave those lands over for adoption into the Chilean National Park System. Coescar was the largest single one of those new units that was created, and an adjacent marine reserve was also subsequently established. So it was really an extraordinary deal. And I had the great privilege of actually being there on the day, there in the Chacabuco Valley, outside the visitor center of Patagonia National Park, where Chris and President Bachelet signed the agreements. And it was quite moving for those of us who had known and loved Douglas Tompkins, that he was not there to see it because he had died
Sure.
shortly before in a kayaking accident just outside the park boundary on a big water body. So that place resulted from an extraordinary act, really the largest act of wildlands philanthropy in Earth history that I'm aware of, whereas about 11 million acres were added to the Chilean National Park System in one fell swoop.
So
Really incredible.
if viewers are getting inspired by this to do what they can to help preserve wild nature, I would just point out that Tom is now with the Northeast Wilderness Trust, and if you go to their website, uh, it'll tell you about a number of very what seem to be very worthwhile projects where you can be your own wildlands philanthropist. You can contribute towards protecting, for instance, the Duran Mountain Wilderness Preserve in Vermont. It's 182 acres. It looks like a lot of it's wetlands from the pictures of it, and they're still looking for more funding for that. So it's great when these billionaires or semi-billionaires pony up their money to preserve wild nature. Doug Tompkins, um, uh, Ted Turner, we're very grateful for their efforts. But we all have a role to play as well. So I'd encourage viewers to support your local or regional land trust as well.
It's vitally important, I think, that individuals do that, and it's a way that's direct and tangible, where people of modest means can support, essentially as their donations are pooled, can support tangible, practical, and beautiful ways of protecting wild places and wild creatures, and thereby also helping to mitigate climate chaos. Every single project that Northeast Wilderness Trust does, every place it protects, is a future old growth forest. 300 years from now, people will walk through those giant trees, which will be storing and sequestering vast amounts of carbon naturally. And supporting the biodiversity of our region. And of course, that's true of people supporting their local and regional land trusts elsewhere, as long as those groups are actually supporting projects that truly do preserve wild places and not sort of put a green sheen on extraction that really doesn't advance the climate mitigation ball very far.
So take a look at the fine print before you write the check.
Well, exactly. I think that's always wise when you're supporting any nonprofit, but there are great, great organizations out there. Kentucky Natural Lands Trust, Northeast Wilderness Trust. There are many organizations working on policy that are absolutely worthy of people's support, doing excellent defensive and offensive work in the realm of public policy. All of these things add up, and they all can, again, help advance this overarching framework for conservation, which is global rewilding. And again, I know I'm going to be repetitive here and I'm repeating myself, but when we have this overarching frame of the earth, an earth of beauty and of abundance, with these big, beautiful ribbons of blue and green wrapping the earth in wildness, supporting all species' right to exist and to flourish, and then helping to support a durable and beautiful human civilization. That's a wonderful aspirational vision. But again, it only happens place by place, project by project, person by person, acre by acre, as people invest their time and their energy, their influence, and their wealth to make these places protected forever. These projects only happen when people who love the land are engaged. And Northeast Wilderness Trust, it just happens to be an organization that I love because I know it's highly efficient in doing those kinds of projects very well, very effectively, and with the exact ethical vision that I embrace, which is that nature for nature's sake is the target, and that is wildly beneficial to people too.
Well, Tom, you've convinced me. I met my wife in Boston about 25 years ago, and some of our favorite uh, activities when we were getting to know each other were hiking and camping in Vermont and New Hampshire. So I'm going to
Fantastic.
make a contribution to your land trust in her name for
Hey, that's
Christmas.
fabulous. Hey, that's so nice. And you know what? Be sure to let me know because I'll match it. And
All right,
I'll
all
make
right,
a contribution too of the same amount. And we'll double our contribution to the trust's work to protect future old growth forests.
wonderful, wonderful. Well, Tom Butler, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us about rewilding today.
Well, it was my great pleasure. I'm really glad to hear that you're doing this project, that you're engaging these important conversations, and particularly, the delicate and sometimes provocative topic of human overpopulation. I'm really glad that you're in the mix there.
Thank you so much, Tom.